Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to Medical Grand Rounds and the 2023 Goldman-Berland Lectureship in Palliative Medicine, hosted by the Providence Center for Healthcare Ethics. I'm Kevin Dirksen, Senior Director at the Center and the Andy and Bev Hansel Endowed Chair in Applied Healthcare Ethics. We're broadcasting live from Providence St. Vincent Medical Center on Teams Live. You can earn continuing education credit for either watching live or a recording of this event, which is available by the same link as the invite for today's presentation. I'll be monitoring the Q&A throughout the session, so please do submit your questions and we'll hold them to the end as time permits. This lectureship is named for two Providence St. Vincent clinical giants who distinguish themselves in providing excellent whole person care we now know as palliative care, Drs. Robert Goldman and John Berland. While Dr. Goldman is no longer with us, his son Tom is joining us today virtually. And I'd like to offer a special hello and extend my gratitude to Dr. Berland, who is here with us at Souther Auditorium with his wife, Carolyn, this morning. We thank the families and friends, as well as Dr. Berland and his wife, for all of your tireless support of this lectureship and of the Providence Center for Healthcare Ethics. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our 2023 Goldman-Berland Lectureship speaker, Dr. Yolanda Wilson. Dr. Wilson is an associate professor in the Albert Nagy Center for Healthcare Ethics at St. Louis University, with additional affiliations in the departments of philosophy and African American studies. She specializes in social and political philosophy, bioethics, and intersectionality. While many academicians have many stops on their academic journey, on their educational journey, Dr. Wilson kept her list of prestigious universities short to Howard University and UNC Chapel Hill, where, by the end, she tallied a bachelor's degree in political science, 2 master's degrees in philosophy, and finally her PhD in philosophy. A recipient of numerous awards and professional honors, Dr. Wilson served as a fellow at the National Humanities Center and a visiting scholar at the NIH Department of Bioethics. I first heard Dr. Wilson present a fascinating talk at the Catholic Health Association's Theology and Ethics Colloquium, finding her perspective to be timely and needed to recalibrate our work toward justice. She is an important voice in the field of bioethics today, and I'm looking forward to learning from her these next 2 days during this lectureship visit with us. Won't you please help me welcome Dr. Yolanda Wilson?
Yeah, so the title is intentionally provocative. And, it's not that I don't think that structural racism is an important conceptual intervention, because I actually do. I think it's an incredibly important intervention in understanding the nature and function of racism. However, I have a few worries about how we think about structural racism. And so the idea of hearts and minds comes from, and I know that Bill Clinton isn't the first person to talk about hearts and minds, but what I remember most clearly about Bill Clinton and why I associate this with him is that we were supposed to have this national conversation on race back in 1997, and one of the things that then President Clinton was concerned about was what role kind of law and policy and the government essentially could play in thinking about how to address racism. And so one thing that he thought was important, or one thing that he was kind of concerned with, was whether, how effective government intervention could be in the absence of changed hearts and minds. So I use the kind of language of hearts and minds as a shorthand to just highlight individual practices and behaviors, and also thoughts and feelings. So the hearts and minds framing aims at both the kind of cognitive, right, what's happening in your head, and the effective modes of racial injustice. So it's the idea that changing people's deeply held racist beliefs may or may not be a key to ending racism, right? It depends on how much weight you want to put on this kind of hearts and minds framing. But he kind of repeats this theme of hearts and minds throughout his political career, and even in 2016 when Hillary Clinton was running for president. There are videos of him, again, evoking this hearts and minds language and thinking about racism conceptually as about just kind of misunderstanding. Like, oh, if we just spent more time around one another, right? The government can't force that, but if we could just spend more time around one another, that maybe that'll change hearts and minds. So he says this again in 2016 at Binghamton University when he's on the campaign trail for Hillary Clinton, right? Although, interestingly enough, Hillary Clinton explicitly rejects this kind of hearts and minds framing in a conversation with Black Lives Matter activists, right, where she says, I don't think you change hearts and minds. I think you change laws. So, right, there's even within their own kind of personal political universe, there's this kind of difference in conceptually what it is that you do in order to address or ameliorate racism. And so I think that, this hearts and minds framing gets us there. Okay, now my slides are getting a little wonky, so I want to make sure that all right, here we are. So here's our little roadmap for the next few minutes, and I'm going to try to time this out in such a way that leaves us a good 10 minutes or so for a Q&A. And so if some sections go a little faster than others, hopefully we can pull those out either in the Q&A now or over the next couple of days. So, I think the case that we'll talk about later today is specifically and explicitly a palliative care case. I think some of the stuff we'll talk about at lunchtime deals more with explicit palliative care concerns. However, I'm a philosopher by training, and so I have to do the conceptual stuff first. It makes me happy to do the conceptual stuff first, and then kind of think about. So if we think about this morning as kind of the global view, and then we distill more and more over the next couple of days. So that's kind of my thought process. All right, so here's the roadmap. Here's where we're going in this talk. I want to highlight some of my own worries about attentiveness to structural racism. And, as I throw that word out, I want to talk a little bit about, what that is. What does it mean to talk about structural racism or structural injustice? So I want to give us kind of a working definition to frame the discussion. And then I want to think about, how how discussion of structural racism appears in the bioethics literature. Actually, there's a new paper out in AJOB. It came out in the April issue about, what's it called? It's by Lau and Carbonell, Oppressive Medical Objects or something like that. And kind of using, we'll talk about that in a second, but yeah, so there's bioethics literature. So there's another paper I can add to the slide. And then I'm going to think about two theorists whose work that I really like on these kinds of questions that kind of bring out my worry and what my friendly amendment will be. One is McAllister Bell, who's a philosopher, on moral culpability. And the second is Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who's a sociologist and who has a text that is now a classic called Racism Without Racists. And so I kind of add a friendly amendment to how each of them is thinking about both moral culpability and racism. And so I want to think about what are the underlying values of structural racism? Like when we think about structural racism, what are we seeing? What are we discussing? What are we getting at? What kind of undergirds discussions of structural racism? And then I'll get to my own kind of positive thesis. And for the last month or two, I've been calling this weaponized helplessness. So I don't think that's going to change. I think I might be sticking with that for now. And I'll kind of give you a sense of how I think what weaponized helplessness is an intervention on this problem before reaching some conclusions. All right, let me go back. Sorry. Somehow my slides on this page aren't as great. Okay, so those of you who are of a certain age will know who this is as I share some of my opening worries. My first worry is that attentiveness to structural racism forecloses, right, shuts down, ameliorating, right, the possibility of making better or addressing other factors that allow racism to continue and flourish. Now, I will say this is not unique to the concept of structural racism, this idea of kind of foreclosing other possibilities, and I'll talk about that in a second. My second worry is a worry about moral culpability and collective action, which are two slightly different things, but for our purposes, we can put them together. So in the philosophical literature, especially in the social and political literature, there's a lot about what's known as the collective action problem, which is, for example, everybody recognizes there's a problem. I'll give it to you in a nutshell, right? Everybody recognizes there's a problem. It will take everyone working together to solve the problem, but then how do we get started in solving the problem, right? How do we make the necessary commitments that would lead us to get started and to stick with the kind of problem solving? And this is just a general kind of problem whenever you have groups of people getting together. And I think that kind of solving issues connected to racism partly involve a collective action problem, and then moral culpability, a kind of broad question in ethics, right? Who is responsible ethically for some wrong that is happening? And then how do you make sense of that claim that someone is responsible? Okay. So that's a worry. Again, we'll talk about these things in a little bit more detail. My third worry is that structural racism reflects the values of individuals who make and implement policy, right? Structural racism, I think sometimes when we talk about structural racism, it just kind of exists out there in the world somewhere, but it's easy to forget that actual people make policies and engage in practices. And so, while particularly in the economics literature, there's this kind of notion about how racist institutions or practices can continue even in the absence of individual malice. And I think sometimes that point gets hung up on a lot and does a lot more, it obscures the fact that individual people still are responsible for making policy. And then my final kind of worry, and that's kind of my positive thesis, is that relying too heavily on the concept of structural racism, particularly without any kind of deeper attachment, leads to what I call weaponized helplessness, right? Okay. So I want us to, get, again, a kind of working definition, working framework. And of course, this isn't the only way to think about structural injustice, but Powers and Faden have done some really interesting work over the years on structural injustice broadly. So the kind of broad category would be structural injustice. Structural racism is a variety of structural injustice, just to keep the terminology clear and separate. So by structural, Powers and Faden mean, and I love their definition here, right? That social arrangements, including certain social practices, have highly consequential, differential, and sometimes unjust effects on individuals just because they are members of identifiable social groups. Now, I want to be clear that, Powers and Faden, again, aren't the first people to talk about structural injustice, right? I mean, Stokely Carmichael, who became Kwame Ture, is talking about structural injustice way back in the 60s, right? He's writing about that. The Combahee River Collective, right? So there are people who are writing about this, thinking about this, using this kind of language even back in the 1960s. And then you think about someone like Du Bois, he's kind of pointing to these kinds of concepts, even though he doesn't use that explicit language as early as like the 1920s, I think. So it's not a new idea. This Powers and Faden book, I want to say it came out in 2018 or 19. It's a good book if you're interested in these kinds of questions. It gives you a good overview. So that's structural injustice, just again, to get us some language on the same page. Now, structural injustice, right, is when, so I'm highlighting now the injustice aspect of the structural, is when social structural impediment profoundly, pervasively, asymmetrically, and near inescapably diminishes an individual's most important prospects. Such impediments are often multiple and mutually reinforcing, and they systematically favor some at the very great expense of others. Moreover, these disadvantaging effects are often compounded, perpetuated, and sustained over the course of a lifetime and frequently over the course of generations. And I think that, this last sentence or this last bit is incredibly important when we're thinking about how this looks in healthcare systems, right? Over a lifetime, right? That this injustice compounds over a lifetime and that it compounds over generations. And, I think we're just kind of getting to the point where we broadly talk about health as something that exists over generations, right? I think there's a lot of focus and interest in the individual and the individual body and the individual patient, but to think about the compounding effects of injustice as kind of reaching out into communities, but not just in kind of discrete time slices, but to think about how this compounds over the course of generations. So I think that that's an important intervention. All right, now just to give a little bit of, look, I don't want to give the impression that I'm poo-pooing conversation about structural racism. I have some worries about what happens not just in the literature, but what happens kind of on the ground in institutions. But that doesn't mean that conceptually I have a problem here. So there's been some interesting work coming out in the past 2-3 years about, addressing this issue, touching on this issue. So this piece by the Hastings Center, A Critical Moment in Bioethics, very good volume, kind of thinking about race and racism. There's conversation about structural racism here. I have a piece in here, not necessarily as a shameless plug, but just to let you know so that you don't think that I'm trying to make a shameless plug. It's a really good volume, right? Again, another issue came out in Bioethics, March 2022. And I know I'm talking to the doctors in the room largely, so I have to point y'all to the bioethics literature a little bit. Again, I think I have a piece here too. Oh yes, I literally have a piece called Empathy and Structural Injustice in the Assessment of Patient Noncompliance, right? That came out in that issue in Bioethics. All right, so again, I'm not poo-pooing it. I think that conceptually, again, to repeat, I think is a really important conceptual intervention. However, and I want to get explicitly to my worries here, structural racism and moral culpability, and I want to think about racism without racist, right? Okay, so moral culpability. Who is morally responsible, not just for structural racism itself, but also for addressing it, for removing it, right? If there is a responsibility assigned to someone, right? And this is where the kind of moral culpability worry and the collective action worry kind of intervene, right? Intersect on one another, right? What does it mean to be responsible, right? If somebody is responsible, but no particular person is responsible, then how do we kind of get this going off the ground, right? And so one thing that you do is just say, oh, the problem is too big. And we see that with climate change, right? We see that with other kinds of issues too, right? Oh my God, the problem is just so big. So here's the point, and I joke in the talk where if this were kind of a traditional DEI talk, you get the PowerPoint with the like the 90s clip art, and you'd say, whose responsibility is it? Everybody's, and you get the high five and like the multiracial cast of characters. And I'm not quite sure that, we all go to the session, it's often mandatory. Yay, everybody's responsible, and then we all go back to our lives, right? And I think that kind of highlights one of the problems here. We high five and go back to our lives. All right. So I have another, yeah. So I think about a variety of racism, and this was a piece in Bioethical Inquiry. Racism as contempt. And so in addition to the collective action problem, right? Whose responsibility is it? Everybody's, but okay, like whose really is it? Like, how do we get that off the ground? All right, so in addition to that problem, I think we should pay more attention about how structural racism is bidirectional. That is, right, structures impinge upon our practices and, right, they create restraints and constraints about what we can and can't do. But also, individual practices and attitudes shape structures, right? I mean, they're a reflection of something, the policies that we adopt. And so I think about, here's where I'm turning to McAllister Bell's work. Hard Feelings, The Moral Psychology of Contempt. And again, her book isn't specifically about racism per se. I think she has a chapter where she talks about racism, might not even be an entire chapter. I don't think this book got, oh, the mic suddenly came on in a different way. Is that me or does it sound very different? I was like, oh, I was like, who's talking? Oh, that's me talking. Is somebody else talking? Okay. Oh, sorry about that. Wow. Yeah, so I don't think this book got the uptake that it should have gotten when it came out. It's several years old now. And I'm not just saying that. So full disclosure, McAllister and I went to graduate school together. But I do think it's a really great book, and she's a great philosopher. She has, I think, a chapter here on where she's thinking about race. So it's not explicitly a book about race and racism, but I think, again, conceptually, I think it's really interesting. So racism as contempt, and this is Bell, right? Race-based contempt is focused not just on the supposed actions of members of racial groups, but on the persons themselves. If you are seen as low in virtue of your race, then attempting to win esteem by outperforming others is unlikely to be successful. Under these conditions, your successes are not likely to redound in your favor. Instead, you will likely be interpreted as the beneficiary of good luck or of some external factor. So I just want us to put a pin in this idea right here, this idea of racism as contempt and being directed towards persons and being a reflection of a kind of disvalue of persons, right? I want us to put a pin right here. And then I want us to pick up Eduardo Bonilla Silva's work, right? And this book, again, it's become a classic. It's now in its 6th edition. Let me go back. I think it's, well, last time I looked, it was in its 6th edition. You know, we should all be so lucky to have a book that has this many printings. But Bonilla Silva writes, whites have developed powerful explanations which have ultimately become justifications for contemporary racial inequality that exculpate them from any responsibility for the status of people of color. Now, I want us to hold these two thoughts in our head, right? This idea of contempt and the kind of inherent disvaluing of some persons, and what Bonilla Silva is doing and saying, look, there are these kind of important justifications that white people will make to absolve themselves of any responsibility for the kind of artifacts of racism, okay? So let's hold these two thoughts in our head. And so one thing that Bonilla Silva does, again, in his text, Racism Without Racism, and again, I highly recommend this book. I think it's a really cool, sorry about this. I keep trying to kind of make my slides on my screen match the slides here. Okay, so one thing that Bonilla Silva discusses is, look, well, so this is interesting because I remember reading this book when it first came out, and then I think I read a later edition, like a 2nd or 3rd edition. The 6th edition has come out like in the last year or two. So it'll be interesting. I should read, yeah. This will be interesting to see how his take has changed. I think the overall argument is still the same. But the kind of opening premise of the earlier editions was that, you know, it's out of fashion in most places to just explicitly do and say racist things. But I don't know if you can really say that anymore with the same level of confidence. And so he says, you know, instead, right, this is Bonilla Silva's kind of larger point, right? Instead, what you'll find is this kind of attentiveness to so-called non-racial dynamics in order to explain racism. And so one popular example that comes from I think the economists love thinking about rational choice and all that stuff. Like they'll say things like, you know, we can end up with all white neighborhoods without any white people actually being racist, right? That has nothing to do with that. It just turns out that you can have all of these other kind of non-racial preferences that lead you to a space that becomes all white, right? And so, you know, you can say something like, look, I want a neighborhood where everyone has a graduate degree and likes hockey and listens to Will Call. I don't know. Right. If you have those kinds of, right, if those are your preferences and that's who you want your neighbors to be, then those are kind of non-racial reasons that you kind of end up with white neighborhoods. And so, just as an example, and so Bonilla Silva says, you know, look, you can use kind of market dynamics or education or, you know, the example that always gets me in trouble, schools, right? I think that becomes code for how many white people live in a neighborhood, right? I want to live somewhere with good schools. Right? Okay. Because implicitly, well, we don't need to talk about what implicitly that meant. Well, I hope we can talk about that during the Q&A if anybody's confused about what I mean by that. All right. And so this is what Bonilla Silva describes as kind of contemporary, the explanations for contemporary racial inequality. But he says, you know, he contrasts this with what he calls Jim Crow racism, which I think is having a comeback. I mean, I think it's like 90s fashion. It's in vogue again. Jim Crow racism relies on arguments regarding kind of moral or biological inferiority of the disfavored group, right? Like, oh, there's just something inherently wrong with these people, as an explanation for why. But, you know, again, going back to the new racism, the contemporary racism, those explanations can be something like market dynamics or some sort of naturally occurring phenomena like living in a hurricane-prone area or something like that. Like, oh, these houses are all devalued because they're on the edge. You know, there's an interesting thing happening in Miami now where historically Black people lived a little further away from the beach because, you know, the beach was the desired land. And as climate change is happening and people are desiring to live more inland, suddenly those areas are becoming a lot more desirable. And right. So again, that can be kind of market dynamics and a kind of way that kind of climate change and racism intersect. Oh, and culture. All right. So we don't need to spend a whole bunch of time on this. We can. So we think about what are these underlying values, right, that Bonilla Silva is really interested in. So say something like, you know, Americanness, patriotism, hard work, and kind of inherently, implicitly whiteness, right? What are the underlying about, right? What is a good, hardworking American? Like that's the language that some folks appeal to. And those are, right, people work hard. Working hard is also, I think, often code for whiteness because there's this perception that other people don't work hard. And as I was saying in kind of an earlier iteration of this talk, so my family's from Georgia, both sides, for as far back as we all know. And I think about like my daddy, who was a sharecropper. Like I can't even imagine, like the idea that Black people don't work hard and knowing literally what he did, you know, and I still, like, if you go to my mother's house now, my father's deceased, but if you go to my mother's house now, we're like 5 miles from a cotton field. I think it's less than 5, maybe like 3 miles from a cotton field. And you see cotton grows like down to here. And so my daddy would talk about getting up before sunrise to pick cotton because whatever pennies a pound they were getting. Does anybody just want to take a wild guess at why you want to pick cotton at sunrise? Well, yeah, it's hot outside, clearly, in South Georgia. But if you're getting pennies a pound, the dew, yes. If anybody, so next time you go to like the drugstore, just pick up a bag of cotton balls and see how light that is. So if you're getting paid by the pound, right? Given how light cotton is, just the little bit of morning dew, like you're trying hard to just give some weight to, right? Like think how like morning dew doesn't weigh very much, but that made the difference between getting up and picking cotton at like 5 in the morning versus waiting till like 7 in the morning, in addition to the heat. So yeah, this idea of working hard, I just kind of shake my head at it when I hear those conversations. So, all right. So going back to Bonilla Silva, right? He says, like the new racism is, offers these complex, sometimes non-racial explanations that white people use to explain the persistence of racism. But my friendly amendment, right, to kind of get us back to structural racism, I want to say we can focus less on cultural behavior of individual Black people. And maybe I need to change that slide because I don't know if that's quite right. I mean, I think that's fine. But I would just add that sometimes the explanation focuses on the system that white people are especially helpless to address, right? So you want to do something, but oh my God, the problem is just too big. And so I think that an important feature of structural racism is its persistence, even in the absence of racial animus. And so I think that becomes really important, right? So even if everyone's hearts and minds change tomorrow and everybody just decided that they love people of color, including people of color, who have sometimes internalized those sensibilities, that there would be this persistence. And so, what I would add to Bonilla Silva's account of the new racism is, adding this notion of, oh, right, the system is just too big. Right. All right, so here's a case I want to talk about kind of briefly. And this woman on the screen is Barbara Dawson. And she lived in Blountstown, Florida. And so this is a case from 2015. It's amazing how time flies because it feels like it was just like 2-3 years ago. I think 2015 is almost 8 years ago. That's crazy. All right, so I write about her in the Bioethics, Race, and Contempt piece. And I used her case as an example of the contemptuous racism that I thought about. But here I want to talk about the possibility of structural racism, but I guess specifically institutional racism, which we can talk about that distinction, and how kind of no one is responsible, like no one is responsible for her death. So she's 57, enters the emergency department at Calhoun Liberty Hospital in Blountstown, Florida in December 2015. And she says that she's having difficulty breathing. Has anyone heard of this? Heard of this? Okay, one or two people have, right? So what's wild is, again, I told you I'm from Georgia, but I'm from South Georgia. Like when I say I'm from Georgia, people go, "Oh, Atlanta," and I'm like, no, people from Atlanta say they're from Atlanta, and people who are really from Atlanta say Atlanta. Yeah, so no, I'm from deep South Georgia. So growing up, our local CBS news station, and it still is actually, our local CBS news station comes out of Tallahassee, Florida. So I know way more about Florida politics than I should. And Tallahassee was like where we went for entertainment and excitement because it was closer than Atlanta. So this was local news when I went home that Christmas, because it happened in December. And I think it kind of made the national news, but I don't think it was huge national news. So she showed up in the emergency department. She said she was having difficulty breathing. She was seen by healthcare personnel. I want to be very clear about that. However, they did not, at whatever point they felt that she could or should be discharged. And she felt that she should not be discharged. And now accounts vary about how vociferous she was in protesting leaving the hospital. But it is clear that at some point security was called, and the police, which in a small town means the police were called, and the sheriff came, physically dragged her out of the hospital, where she promptly collapsed before making it to the cruiser before she could be put into the cruiser. And so the arresting officer says, falling down like this, right? So we got the dash cam recording, and you can find it if you're interested. Falling down like this, laying down, that's not going to stop you from going to jail, right? And so at that point, accounts differ at how long she was left on the ground. Some say as little as 10 minutes, some say maybe up to 30 minutes. But at some point, they realized that she was not faking. She was taken back into the emergency department, where she later died. She had a pulmonary embolism, right? So within a few hours, she was dead. And so what I find fascinating about her case, I mean, it's certainly tragic, and you know, as I said in the kind of in the Bioethics, Race, and Contempt paper, kind of, I don't think it's useful. I don't think it's as useful to it. Maybe there's a place for it, but if we're thinking about kind of global system changing, I'm not sure how useful it is to try to assess how racist any one individual was. I think that that can give you important information. And I think that certainly if there were an actual will to address that, then I think it would be important. I'm interested, at least for our purposes, to think about how what happened to her is a reflection of a series of decisions that were made, that at several places of decision point, different decisions could have been made. And that's not to say that she would have survived, right? I mean, we know in patient care, sometimes you do everything right and you do everything you can and the patient still dies. I do think that in this instance, and I've written this like this is a position I've taken on a few cases. I think in this instance, there's a kind of indignity of both her treatment and her dying and death that can be traced to how we think about and implement policies and procedures, and particularly how modes of presentation and communication get interpreted and penalized differently. Now, I'm not saying, right, and I know sometimes when I say things like that, then all the clinicians want to jump on me and say, are you saying we should just let patients, hit us over the head? I'm like, no one thinks that. At the same time, so what was said in Miss Dawson's case was, well, she was swearing. Well, she was yelling and swearing. Well, if I couldn't breathe, if I couldn't breathe, I might have some choice words to say too. If you're telling me to go home, you're fine, and I'm panicking or afraid, like that has got to be a terrifying feeling to know, right? I could imagine just the sense of helplessness, or the sense of worry or being afraid, that something like the impending sense of doom of not being able to breathe. And so I think, again, also the kind of protocols that we have in place, and this is what I mean when I say like there are decision points and that policies get created by people and implemented by people. No one said that she was violent. No one said that they were afraid. And yet it seems that it was consistent with policy to have her arrested for refusing to leave. And I also think it's interesting that, we tell patients to advocate for themselves. You can just Google that. You'll see the Today Show has these segments, all the little morning news shows will have these segments about, advocate for yourself and don't let the doctor dismiss you and don't let the nurse dismiss you. And if you really think something is wrong, you have to fight for yourself. And then the other piece that kind of that I think is worth talking about and thinking about is that she's in a small rural community here, about 2 hours from Tallahassee. It's the only hospital 4 miles away. And I think she was known in the community to kind of oh, your doctor won't listen to you. Come on, I'll take you to the hospital. Like, I'll take you to your doctor's office and I'll come with you to your appointment, which we're told to do. Take a friend with you to help ask questions. Right? And so to be penalized for doing those very things, to go back to Bell's point in the kind of racism as contempt point, that when one is disvalued as a person, their actions aren't likely to be right. Nobody's going, good for her, she advocated for herself. That the actions are interpreted through a lens of being disvalued as a person, right? And so what I'm interested in is kind of the ways that both kind of structural and institutional racism and how staff may see themselves as helpless. Like, I just did what I was supposed to do. The protocol says when a patient doesn't leave, you call the police. What was I supposed to do? And so I think this is where this takes me, right? To this question of weaponized helplessness. What do I mean here? That we'll adopt kind of the language and mode and concept of structural racism, right? Even if we don't use the word structural racism, we'll say something like the system or the problem is too big, in order to avoid individually engaging in efforts to ameliorate racism, right? So sometimes you just, the problem is just too big, right? It's weaponized, right? And I think the word weaponized is really important here, because the perpetrator of weaponized helplessness presents themselves as really interested in, like, really, I want to help. I want to do better. I want to make this better. But I just feel powerless, right? There's nothing I can do. I'm hamstrung by the system. Additionally, the perpetrator may want brownie points for merely acknowledging structural racism, right? I mean, that was a thing in 2020 when everybody was reading when white people were reading how to be anti-racist. And what was that D'Angelo book? White Fragility. Like, everybody's reading that and like, oh my God, how can you say I'm racist? I was in the reading group and we all read White Fragility and I understand, right? So, like, you don't get points just for doing the reading. This isn't high school, right? And so I think it can manifest in strong or weak forms. And so here's one thing I want to think about. So I take this idea from some of the psychological literature of learned helplessness. This idea where if you kind of continually if you're continually met with kind of negative reaction or response to attempting to do something, at a certain point, you stop trying, right? I mean, so I'm kind of playing on that literature, right? So you see the ladies in the cage, and she's so despondent over it, she doesn't even realize that the door is open and she could just walk out, right? That's kind of a manifestation of learned helplessness. And then weaponized incompetence. Again, I'm kind of playing on these two ideas, right? I guess I should have flipped the slides. It comes out of the feminist literature. And a lot of that, what's so interesting, it's so interesting what things kind of catch on social media. So like the last year or so, you've seen a lot of women in particular, and some like straight men in relationship talking about weaponized incompetence in relationship. What does that mean? It's the way, so weaponized incompetence, for those of you who don't know, is the kind of intentionally screwing things up. And it often happens, not exclusively, but a lot of literature points to how it happens in kind of heterosexual partnership around domestic tasks. So men will intentionally screw up how to load the dishwasher, knowing that their female partner will do it instead, right? And at a certain point, we'll just stop asking them to do things around the house, right? Oh my God, I can't do laundry, right? I'll just do, and it turns into an I'll just do it kind of situation. But no, I mean, I'm one who doesn't think that men are stupid. I remember when my partner and I were first kind of seeing each other, and he's like, how do you turn on the washing machine here? He's at my house trying to do some laundry. And I said, all of the appliance manuals are in this drawer right here. And so, if you have any questions, you can just go to that drawer and I've kept them for you. Or there's a QR code on some of the appliances. So just use your phone and, we can all figure this out, because I love having you here, but I don't want an extra project. And so we had to get that straight. like in the first couple weeks. Right. So what is weaponized helplessness? So to go back to the slide, right? The weak forms of weaponized helplessness is just a kind of inertia, right? The problem is just too big. Oh my God, I wish we could fix this. I just don't know what to do. And the strong form, I think, is particularly pernicious. And it may manifest as actively thwarting efforts to bring about change by focusing on things like civility. I don't like how you said that to me. Therefore, I won't support this effort to address racism. I care about addressing racism, but I just don't like the tone. And so therefore, right, fit is language. I don't know if y'all say that in the healthcare system as much. I know in academia, that's a big thing. Oh, we like this person, but we just not sure if they fit the culture in the right way. And a kind of both-siderism, right? Like, oh, we can talk about gender affirming care, but we also have to have Scott Howley to kind of give the other side of how, or we also have to have, DeSantis here to tell us all the ways that can go wrong. And it's like, really, is DeSantis really the person we want to so again, the kind of thwarting of efforts, right? And so I'll kind of stop here. See, I'm good with this timer, man. Yeah, so what's the upshot? I think we have to be intentional about working to kind of make things better, right? And I think that weaponized helplessness becomes a way to kind of undermine the important conceptual intervention that comes from structural racism. And it becomes an excuse to just not do the work, right? So again, I think structural racism is an important conceptual intervention. So I think my worry here is about how does kind of putting it into action manifest, right? What are the pitfalls of putting it into action? And so, yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Any questions here in the room? Well, I'll start with one from, yes, fine. No, go ahead. No, please.
I mean, this is, thank you for this amazing talk. It's so rare and special and important, I think, for us in medicine to be able to just even hear this kind of thinking and be credited with the ability to follow it. So, so my question for you is it's a really pragmatic one from the perspective of, I'm a resident here, so I'm still in training. And I guess, when this woman who you talked about in Florida, which is actually where I grew up.
Okay.
Although in South Florida, when this woman came into the ED and these things happened and this event, culminated in her arrest instead of her being cared for in a way that was appropriate. I mean, what would you as a practical matter, what would you think that the people on the ground in the situation could do to avoid having, falling into this mode of, my hands are tied, like this is the policy, like I'm not the one who makes the rules here, and so forth. Right? Especially people who feel like they might not be kind of the final word on what's happening with this person, right? Like nurses or other, people who might not have been the ones who call the cops.
Yeah, I mean, the power dynamics at play are real. And so I don't want to, pretend as though they aren't. At the same time, I think that sometimes being kind of on the lower end of the power dynamic doesn't mean that one is powerless. And I think that sometimes we conflate those two things. A simple, maybe we can just escort her outside to cool off for a minute, right? I mean, those are just kind of simple things that don't necessarily involve calling the police right in that moment. Or even if you call them like, hey, hold off for a minute, let's see if we can, let's count to 10. Let's take well, she was having difficulty breathing. I was going to say, let's all take a deep breath, but I think that was the issue on the table, was that she couldn't. Yeah, so there are those kind of smaller interventions that can just sometimes cool a situation. Or even, I think sometimes what happens, I mean, many of us in this room have been patients. Sometimes just being heard, like just wanting to feel like someone actually hears you, can calm a situation in ways that I think goes underappreciated on the care side of things. And so it seems as though maybe she was getting more agitated because she felt like she wasn't being heard. And so I think those are kind of smaller interventions, I think. Like, let's hear what she's saying. And I could hear somebody saying, well, she's got to stop swearing, or she's got to calm down. Okay, well, let's work on that happening before we call security, or before we have this woman physically dragged out of here. Yeah, which doesn't mean that you're going against your attending's clinical judgment, because I know that becomes a thing, right? The attending is like, this person's fine, they can go home. Right, that's a way of kind of going around without directly confronting the clinical judgment of the attending. I mean, sometimes attendings are wrong, and I have my own feelings about MDs. Y'all make me nervous and at the same time frustrate me deeply as the philosopher in the room.
Well, we'll jump to the chat here. So we've got a question. Have you seen a healthcare system do it well when moving into action versus helplessness?
No, but that doesn't mean that none have. I just haven't seen it. Yeah, but I will say that I don't spend as much time on the clinical side. I spend more time on the theoretical side. So, I haven't seen, of course, I haven't seen them all, but I probably have even by those lights, I probably haven't seen as many. I think, no, I can't even name them. I was gonna name one place, and then I remembered, no, when you talk to the people who actually work there, that's a different thing, right? And that's a different, right? I mean, their faces, there's what's on the website, here are the things we care about. And then when you talk to the people who actually work there, you might get a very different story. So I think that becomes a challenge too, right? What looks good on paper versus what's actually happening on the ground. So I remember years ago, I was on the APA, the American Philosophical Association Committee for the Status of Women. And I don't know how much y'all track kind of what happens in philosophy, probably not at all, or philosophy gossip, probably not at all also. But the APA Committee for the Status of Women had developed this site visit program where they go to different philosophy departments and just interview everyone there and ask, do these climate studies, right? They do these site visits and do these climate studies. And the men in almost all of these departments would go, oh, no, our department is great. We don't have any problems with gender. It's wonderful. It's great. It's perfect. And then you talk to the women, and the women had these horror stories, just these wild stories. And it was so bad in one place, I can call them by name because they made the news, Colorado, that the recommendation was, y'all just don't need to have any more alcohol at your parties. Y'all don't need to just stop drinking. You know what? Just stop admitting grad students. Just stop, like, y'all just really need to get it together for a little bit, and then we can come back and do another climate study, because this is just out of hand. I mean, it was like, Caligula over there or something. I don't know what they were doing, but again, the men were like, oh no, this is all great. It's fine. What? There are alcohol fueled like pressures, like, what? Where is this happening? Right? All the men are like, where is this happening?
So we have another question here that might be the last, depending upon how much I yak on here, that connects to a comment that I really appreciated that you made around structural racism can exist without the sort of overt signs of racial animus. And the person in the comments is asking a question about maybe some more socially macro aspects or economic aspects like capitalism, and ways that there are things that are fueling, the ongoing structural injustice that you're pointing us toward here. Any comment on what are some of the other tensions, drivers that continue to perpetuate these systems, Dr. Wilson?
Yeah, certainly capitalism. I was trying to find that slide, that specific slide, but yeah, certainly capitalism. I definitely think that's there. Sexism, because I definitely think that white women in particular have a very strong interest in maintaining racism. And you have there's a strong kind of sexual and partnership interest. There's a strong, right? I mean, there's this idea that we all want the best for our kids. At least that's what people who have kids tell me. And there are ways in which wanting the best for your kids as a white woman incentivizes certain kinds of white supremacist behaviors and alignments. And so I think sexism, the intersection of sexism and racism, of capitalism and racism, of kind of environmental racism, and right. So I think that there are a lot of dynamics at play that incentivized kind of maintaining of white supremacy. Right. I mean, so I'm a big fan, and I know we got to go. I'm a big fan of like the show Succession. I don't know if anybody watches that, but the characters I find most fascinating are the white women on that show, and the ways that they get very indignant about the sexism, but they're perfectly fine being in bed with this kind of overtly racist media conglomerate that is, Waystar.
This is more just to ask you to articulate a little bit more for me, because you've just started so many thoughts for me at once, which is great. Is there something about, like, as everybody's trying to sort of get to some goal, the groups you struggle with the most are actually the ones who are just one step ahead than like the 10 steps ahead? Or your comment just about the white women are, kind of beaten back the people that are on their heels.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Kimberly Crenshaw has written about this in some of her older work, and so has Adrienne Davis, who's a law professor at WashU now. The kind of but-for status that white women have with regards to racism, and that Black men have with regards to sexism sometimes, right? So they're both kind of writing about intersectionality here. And yeah, I'm sorry, I missed the last part of your question, but I was thinking about this idea of, I would even add, certainly living in DC in the 90s, gay white men is kind of availing themselves of a certain kind of sexism and racism, but being deeply concerned with homophobia, and right. So this kind of the but-for status is the language that they use. This kind of way of seeing yourself as just right. I'm this close to being and doing and having what heterosexual white men have, and so my interests may be in, right. So then, I mean, that's a decision point, right? Are my interests in, furthering justice for everyone, or are my interests in aligning myself more closely or positioning myself so that I can have what heterosexual white men have? And those are two different questions, and those are going to lead to two different kind of strategic decisions. And so, yeah, with the question of white women or gay white men, or even or Black men, right? That becomes the question about, am I preoccupied with a kind of justice framework? And if I am, then there are going to be moments when I may do things that are outside of my individual interest, but that are better for the collective. And I mean, that's a hard thing to ask of people. I mean, that's a serious question among philosophers, or among political philosophers, this idea of kind of public versus private reason. is how the problem is framed in political philosophy, right? And the kind of common example there is like a stag hunt, or right. So a stag hunt, we're all a group, and we all know that it would be better for us if we could hunt this stag, and we know the stag is running through the forest, and so we need to position ourselves in different places to give us the best possible chance of catching the stag for everyone. This is kind of a collective action problem, but it's also, it's not really, it is more of a public versus private reason, right? So at my little station where I'm waiting for the stag to come, I see a rabbit hop by. It would be in my individual interest to hunt the rabbit and take it home for myself and my immediate friends or family. But it would be better for the community if I waited for the stag to come by, or in hopes that everybody else is gonna, right? And so do you have defectors who go get the rabbit for themselves? Or do you have kind of the people who hang in there and is like, look, I'm gonna pass up this rabbit, even though I know in the moment it would be better for me individually, and wait for the stag because that's gonna be better for everyone. And the stag is gonna give us more meat long term, even though we have to share. I mean, that's a long-term question in political philosophy. And so I think, I don't think it goes away when you think about, racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia and classism and environmental racism, right? I think what we're seeing is a manifestation of that kind of thing, of the kind of public versus private reason.
Well, won't you help me thank Dr. Wilson for this justice framework? Thank you.